Well, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Leslie Hadfield to you. Professor Hadfield began teaching African history at Brigham Young University in 2010. She joined the history department shortly after completing her PhD in African history from Michigan State University. Her research interests focus on South African liberation movements and Black South African nurses. She's conducted extensive oral history interviews, which are an important part of her work in social history. Professor Hadfield has lived in South Africa and speaks Xhosa. She also has studied Swahili in Tanzania and has a broad range of interests in African history throughout the continent. We're very fortunate to have her here at BYU. At the university, she teaches a variety of courses, including History 200, The Historian's Craft, and History 202, World Civilizations Since 1500. But she also teaches courses in her specialty, like History 261, Modern Africa, History 336, South African Liberation Movements, History 366, Slavery and the Slave Trade in Africa and the Atlantic. So you can see she really brings a specialty in African culture and history that we haven't had at BYU for some time, and so we're fortunate to have her here with us. She's also published a variety of articles relating to her research interests and has received several fellowships, including Fulbright Hayes Doctoral Dissertation Research Award, a Fulbright U.S. Student Fellow in Eastern Cape, South Africa, as well as some fellowships and awards here on campus. Please join with me in welcoming Professor Hadfield to us. Her lecture is entitled, What African History Teaches Us. Thank you.
Thank you, Rex. It's great to work with Rex on campus, and he really gets a lot of the credit for coming up with this idea. So I don't know if we can dim the lights on this. Do you know how to do that? Oh, they got it. Okay, great. Okay, let me get started. Over the course of the 1600s and the 1700s, the Balanta, a politically decentralized group of people living along the upper Guinea coast, which you can see here, they adopted certain strategies to deal with the transatlantic slave trade, and this will be familiar to some of you in the audience. I've read it in my classes. Before this time period, a lot of these people had lived in dispersed households, so different areas, small groups. They didn't have a centralized government, highly centralized government. And during this time, they began to consolidate their villages into tabankas. This was a new term that referred to these stockaded and compact villages. And in this way, they could better defend themselves against raids from other groups of people in the area. And houses were arranged in close circles, and villages had these walls made of pointed stakes or huge tree trunks. And the Balanta at this time also changed their agricultural practices, which are pictured here. Before, they had been engaged in a lot of different agricultural practices, and instead of focusing on yams in the highland areas or upland areas, they began to focus on paddy rice production in these lowland, wet areas covered with mangroves. So you can see some of these mangroves here, and I don't know if this is a pointer or not. Aha, it is. And you can see here, this is a picture of where you'd have these mangroves and rice paddies built into these areas here. So this was a change that they made over the course of the 1600s and 1700s. These lowland regions were more isolated, and you can imagine if you want to protect yourself as you're doing agriculture, this would be a good place to do that. And paddy rice also sustained large populations. It was easier to store, and it traded better than other crops. And when people were living in these more concentrated settlements, then that was very helpful for them. So these changes in settlement patterns and agricultural practices had social implications and cultural implications. For example, young men became particularly important to the defense and maintenance of the tabankas and paddy rice production. particularly for preparing dikes, and you can see that picture on the right there. It would take a lot of, or it does take a lot of labor to prepare these dikes and deal with these mangrove forests. Balanta elders devised 3 strategies to control these young men. One, they used social ridicule. They started to say, they called those who left for urban employment, who left these tabankas, plate lickers. They said, if you're a plate licker, that means you're so poor that you lick other people's plates. And particularly the Portuguese, who at this time were the Europeans who had a lot of influence on the coast. The Balanta also relied on women to conduct trade. This minimized contact of these young men with outsiders who they distrusted during this time, and women became very powerful traders during this time period, and also important to creating alliances with other tabankas. The third strategy they used was they devised this system of incentives. So they created an age grade system. So people, these young men who were born in at the same time period, they became part of this age grade. These are gendered groups of youths and elders, and that was the basic division was between these youths and then these other elders. So this fostered loyalties between these young men who are in the same age grade, and also gave them a stake in the system. That they knew, okay, if I become an elder, then if I stick with this community, I can become an elder, and I can have some of these decision-making powers that the elders do. So this was a way that they could gain status as an elder. Now I start with this example, which comes from a great book by Walter Hawthorne. This is one of his photographs, as a way to illustrate one of the important lessons that African history teaches us. And that is that African societies and peoples have a history. This change happened, settlement patterns, cultural changes. I think in many times in the past, people see Africans as living in the same culture and same ways that they had for thousands of years. Well, we can see in African history that these African societies change over time, just as other societies do. And these changes come from both external forces, even geography, for example, and internal dynamics of society, people acting and responding to their circumstances. Now, mainstream Western academia did not always accept that Africa or Africans had a history. And in fact, the field is relatively young. It wasn't until the 1960s that African history was accepted as a legitimate field of history. And I want to give you some examples of ideas. Hegel, one of the influential philosophers of history, taught in the 1830s, "At this point we leave Africa not to mention it again, for it is no historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit. Historical movements in it, that is, in its northern part, belong to the Asiatic or European world. Carthage displayed there an important transitionary phase of civilization, but as a Phoenician colony, it belongs to Asia. Egypt," he conceded, "will be considered in reference to the passage of the human mind from its eastern to its western phase, but it does not belong to the African spirit. What we properly understand by Africa is the unhistorical, undeveloped spirit still involved in the conditions of mere nature, and which had to be presented here only as on the threshold of the world's history." Interestingly enough, this is just prior to the end of the transatlantic slave trade and just prior to the scramble for Africa, when European countries claimed the territory there. And you can see this shift in ideology at this time, the way that people viewed Africa and a way that legitimized this colonization of Africa. It's also interesting that these ideas were still persistent in the 1950s and even in 1963. After much of Africa had gained its independence from France and Great Britain, Oxford history professor Hugh Trevor Roper said, "Perhaps in the future there will be some African history to teach, but at present there is none. There is only the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness, and darkness is not a subject of history." So this is still in 1963. Much of these ideas changed as African history grew as a mainstream Western field of academia in the 1960s. In the 1950s, no major U.S. postgraduate institution offered African history. In 1958 and 59, there was only one graduate student studying African history. By the 1970s, there were 600 professional African historians in the United States and growing programs offering African history throughout the country. This was a similar trend in France and Great Britain and even on the continent with the establishment of more African-centered history education in the universities. So what caused this change? Definitely the independence movements in Africa. You can see here on this map the year of independence. A huge swath of West Africa gained its independence from the French in 1960, and others followed. The civil rights movement in the United States was also an important part of having more attention to Africa. And in fact, African Americans had long studied Africa, so this was not something very new amongst African intellectuals. But the civil rights movement in the United States, along with the Cold War, helped people take Africa more seriously. They realized they needed to learn more about Africa, and especially as these African diplomats were coming from around the world. Incidentally, Wes Johnson, who was a professor, retired recently, well, maybe in the last, few years. He was one of the very first to do a book on African history. He was here at BYU for a short time. So one of these who started this field of African history in the United States. Another major development involved in the acceptance of African history as a mainstream field of academia has to do with the acceptance of oral history as a legitimate source. Since the 1950s and 60s, history as a field in general has changed to include different perspectives and different methods, and even a different definition of history. And oral history played a big part of that. And this was particularly important to African history. And one of the major figures in this is a man named Jan van Cena. He was a Belgian who studied Central Africa. And he proved that oral traditions could be used as a source. Before this time, many anthropologists who were working in Africa didn't really trust that these myths of origin that people would talk about to say this is how we got here, including all sorts of mythical and religious ideas, they did not see this as being legitimate history. You couldn't use that to really know what was going on at certain times. Well, Jan van Cena came along and he said, if we take these oral traditions seriously, then we can actually go back into the past and find ways where we can put dates to things and find out what had happened. He was, in his book, Oral Tradition is History, and subsequent publications, talked about the different types of oral traditions in African societies. And he talked about how there were lineage lists. So people just talking about their own lineages, going back and saying, this is how I got to where I am, and these are my ancestors. There were king lists as well, very similar, but for an actual kingdom, where they would have these long lists, oral historians who would talk about their kings. And often this was linked with a kind of praise poetry, that there would be particular people in society who were designated as the poet. In South African societies, it's called an mbongi. This person, their job is to learn the praises of the past leaders and in a particular style, recite these at important functions. You also see pictured here a West African griot. These are professional historians in these societies who keep the history of their people through these traditions, these king lists, these praise poetry, and also these long epic tales, or these tales of origin. And these people often will sing the history of their people and families, and many were hired or tied to kings, hired by or tied to kings and lineages. And this was a hereditary position in many West African societies, that you inherited this from your father and you were trained by your father. And they became very important in many of these societies. So there were definitely people within African societies who used these oral traditions to keep their history. And these were some of the things that Jan van Cena looked at. Other oral traditions that he included had to do with folk tales and myths or proverbs. Even the knowledge that is passed on through proverbs, what does it tell us about the past and what has happened in the past, these ideas that come through. So Jan van Cena, working in Central Africa in the late 50s and early 60s, really had a big impact on the way that African was seen and legitimized with this oral history. And most places on the continent were oral societies. There are a few exceptions before Europeans came and started to write the languages. So this was very important as far as this goes. Other historians then followed. He also talked about oral testimonies, so eyewitness accounts, interviews as a journalist would do, that were important to recording history, and also life histories. This is something that feminist historians came and instituted as well. You sit down with a woman, you ask her to tell you her life, and what does that mean from that. Historians of Africa also have relied on linguistic evidence, so historical linguistics has been important. If you're looking back at migrations, for example, along the continent, the Bantu migrations, the people who speak the languages in the Bantu language family, migrated from this region and came down to these other areas. And historians have been able to track the vocabulary used, the kind of grammar used in these languages to find out where these people originated from. This is another way that historians have used linguistic evidence. And finally, of course, along with other histories of other places, archaeological evidence is important to tracking these cultural, political, and economic changes, as well as migrations. So this use of a myriad of sources demonstrates the creativity that historians often use or need to have to understand the past when written documents are unavailable. This is a very important transformation for African history and also in history in general. And the implication for many people who do not have written records is that they have a history. Again, going back to this first point that I wanted to make, that there's a recognition that Africans had a history. Relying on oral sources also led historians to further analyze memory and the influence of perspective on source bias, the bias that sources had. And this often goes along with the post-colonial, post-modern way of interpreting literature and other aspects where we realize that there's a perspective and a bias there, and how do we deal with that when we're trying to find a truth, and can we find a truth when we have all of these different perspectives? As historians were going through to find the history of these continents, or the continent and its various peoples, upon independence, they started to record and hear very different accounts of African history from griots and village elders, all sorts of people than they had found in the European colonial record in these reports and documents. This was quite clear, and it was very evident, obviously, to Africans themselves that there were different perspectives. So African history really worked to bring in this African perspective and also deal with how do we, as historians, get at what happened when we have these very different perspectives. Historians also heard very different historical interpretations from women and former slaves, people who had a different position in society than some of these official kings and other groups. And they began to emphasize, particularly in the late 1980s and 1990s, the need to not only bring in the African voice in African history and African studies, but to include different African perspectives. And this goes back to one very interesting thing, and that is the study of customary law in African history. When a lot of the British governments instituted indirect rule, they relied on African rulers to rule through them. And they called this indirect rule. We're ruling through these chiefs. And they said, you can practice your own law, which they called customary law, because it was supposed to be the traditional law, as long as it didn't, of course, clash with what we would like to do. And how did they decide what customary law was? Well, they often went to village elders or elders in these communities, and often they were men. And you can imagine at a time when there was a lot of change in the society, and going back to the Balanta, you wanted to make sure your youth and your women were following what you would like to have done, then the kind of customary laws that you would get from particular people, the male elders, were different from what you might get from the women. So this was one thing that oral history in Africa also brought about, that not only the need to bring in the African voice, but to include different African perspectives. So oral history moved from a focus on official histories or histories of great African kingdoms of the past, like the Kingdom of Mali. And here is a great example of this on the left. The Epic of Old Mali, which is the tale told by a griot and written down in the 1960s and used in my classes and many other classes. And so it moved from this official history of these highly centralized kingdoms to sitting at what historian David Cohen called Pym's doorway. And this is when he said we need to have the perspective of ordinary people. And David Cohen himself looked at the Luo society and how women, elderly women in Luo society, were considered to be the bearers of knowledge of the history of the people, as well as of surrounding communities. Often they had been married into communities from other communities, and they brought this knowledge with them. And the children would sit with Pym. This was often the name of this woman in Luo society. And they would learn from her about their history. She would tell them stories. And as they grew up, the young men would then go to another place. The young women would stay with Pym. And David Cohen argued and pushed African historians to look at her perspective. What is her interpretation of history? What does that tell us about history? Instead of just looking at these broader events and how they influenced these kingdoms, as well as what we deal with in a lot of social history started by saying, how did these major events in world history impact these people? And he was saying, well, what in historical interpretation, what are the major events according to the perspective of Pym? So we see this change in oral history, pushing us to, again, include the African voice, but also different perspectives. Now, once you start learning about African history, you learn how diverse the continent is. We often make generalizations about the continent, and some people even still think of it or call it a country. But we also, as soon as we make these generalizations about trends in African history, we also find exceptions, and they're always there. To give you an example of how diverse the continent is and how difficult it is to make these generalizations, but also how rewarding it is to study African history, you can see here that the African continent makes up 1/5 of the world's landmass, and here's a map over here to look at so you can see how it compares to other places. And all of these major players in history, Western Europe, the United States of America, China, India, even Argentina, all can fit within the African continent with a little bit of room to spare. So you can imagine across this vast continent, there's often quite a diverse, even within modern nations, you have anywhere from 11 official languages to 24 languages spoken in these countries. And here's a map not detailing all of the languages, but according to some accounts, you have over 1,500 languages spoken on the continent. So a very diverse place, diverse cultures, and diverse peoples. The diversity also plays into class and gender at times, as well as these cultures. And here you can see, even within West Africa, if we go back to this, we have the Mali Kingdom used to stretch all across here. Along the coast, the Upper Guinea coast, you have a very different group of people. The Balanta, pictured here. And here we have Mansa Musa, the most famous Malian king of the past, who apparently flooded the market with gold when he performed the Hajj. And there's another religious differences there, where you have a very diverse continent. And so learning African history helps us see this. We have examples of different women, as I explained, having different experiences than men in their cultures, and different political and economic systems that are running throughout African history from these early times and even to recent times. One thing that I talked about recently in my Modern Africa class was what happened in April 1994 in Africa. Two very different developments at the same time. One, pictured on the left, is Nelson Mandela casting his vote for the first time in South Africa. He was able to, here we had the first fully democratic votes in South Africa at the end of apartheid, which formally started ending in 1990. And this was a major positive development for the continent. Democracy was growing, and we see that in many places in the continent in the 1990s. At the same time, this picture on the right is a woman in front of skulls. She was a survivor of the genocide in Rwanda, the Tutsi against the Hutu. So while one state is creating these new institutions and establishing democracy, another one is seeing the breakdown of relations for a variety of reasons. So it's difficult to generalize across the continent when these, we do that, but when you learn African history, you learn how diverse the continent is and how diverse the different experiences are. Now, as I think about this, and this is something that has been very important, particularly this year, or been in my mind, particularly in the past few months, I can't help but think of how different those responsible for the Kony 2012 video that went viral in March early this year, how they would have responded differently to Joseph Kony in Uganda if they perhaps would have taken an African history course. Perhaps they did. I doubt it, having watched the movie. Because I think that they may not have thought that it takes a white person from the United States to see something to know that it exists in Africa. That we didn't need somebody to go to tell us about Joseph Kony. He already existed, and Ugandans knew he existed, and other people in the region knew he existed. It also doesn't take a white person from the United States to solve the problem. Definitely people can help, international people can help. But I think that it's interesting, this Kony 2012 video had this idea that, oh, I found out about this horrible thing. Why haven't we heard about it before? And we now need to do something about it, and the US is going to offer the solution. I also believe they would have suggested a more complex solution if they understood the complexities of the situation and its causes. When we recognize the diversity of the continent, we also recognize the complexities of what's going on there. What was gratifying about this phenomenon of the Kony 2012 campaign was that Ugandan voices also made it onto YouTube to respond and to educate people. And one particular woman stands out, the way that she said, "This is what's happening. I'm working here on the ground. I'm from Uganda." And we saw other videos of Ugandans watching the Kony 2012 video and responding to it. And that was gratifying for me to see that Ugandan voices were brought in. But I think one thing that we may suffer from in this digital age, and it's not just for African history but broadly, is that we like to have things quick and fast and simple. And one thing that I hope my students in my African history courses realize is that things are complex, and I'm a historian, so I often like to, that's my answer, it's complex. There are many factors, right? But I think African history teaches us too that we need to look at the complexities of these situations, and that there are multiple causes, multiple answers that we need to take into account, and we need to look at different sources as well to understand this complexity. African history teaches us a lot of things that I have not highlighted today, but I think these ideas are pretty important, or a good starting point. That Africa and Africans have a history. We've definitely been taught that through African history. That African voices are important in understanding this history and understanding the continent. We need to listen to Africans themselves. And that we also need to recognize the diversity of the continent and the various sources that we need to use to listen to the different African perspectives. And along with that, it really helps us see how historians and particular, so this is particular for the field of history, can use a number of various sources to get to what happened in the past. And then finally, I think particularly important to today is that we need to recognize complexity, and that is important for us understanding our world in the best way. Now, to end, I think the African Worlds Lecture Series, I get the last word, but we definitely have had a variety of perspectives and opportunities to listen to people throughout the semester with literature from Mozambique and Somalia and Francophone Africa, as well as politics from South Africa. And we also had lectures from the Mali ambassador and a great lecture on democracy in Mauritius. And one thing that I really appreciated about this lecture series is that it did highlight the diversity, as well as it helped us learn from Africa. And I think this is also the final point that I want to make, and that is all of these things, they teach us. And often we think of Africa as this, there's still this idea that we need to go and save Africa, and we need to, as the West, we need to go and help them. But there are a lot of things that we can learn from them. And I think when we have that humility, then it makes our education and our understanding of the world that much better. So I thank you for coming today. And I am definitely going to hang around for a few minutes for questions, and then I have to take off for a meeting before 12. But yes, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Professor Hadfield. Any questions for her? Yes.
Oh, and if we, I think this is being podcasted, so there's the microphone. If you'll wait for the microphone, that'd be great. Thanks.
Okay, it strikes me that you've given this talk in 2012 that you probably could have given in 1962, making this case. They've got a history, it's diverse. I wonder if African historians just must get weary with having to make that same pitch over and over again. I wonder why people have, you feel that people haven't gotten the memo in 2012 after decades of making this argument.
A lot of the first generation of African historians are still around. They still come to the conferences, and they're starting to retire now. So I think they probably still feel that. It's interesting, and I think this goes to the point that I was making about Coney 2012. As we were talking about this at the African Studies Association meeting in Philadelphia, which I went to last week, the director of the African Studies program at our center at Michigan State said he didn't feel like now, James Pritchett is his name, by the way, he felt like now his battle in the classroom was less about ignorance and stereotypes of Africa and more about battling simplifying Africa and simplifying in general. And this really started, I've been noticing this a little bit, but his comments really started to make me think. And I do think we have a greater engagement in Africa. People are going there more, engaging with Africans more. But at the same time, too, we're also battling the media, the kind of stereotypes that come from that. And yeah, in some ways, I understand that it had been 10 years before I was hired at BYU that the history department here did not have an African historian. And there are two other African historians in the state of Utah, one at Utah State and one at Westminster. The University of Utah does not have anyone who teaches African history. So there's still a lot of things that we can do and a lot more that needs to be done as far as education on African history. But also I think the terms have kind of changed a little bit more, recognizing the complexity being a very important part of that. I don't know if that answers.
As far as oral history goes, are there any, is there hesitancy on part of these people to talk about the slave trade era as opposed to, say, just the history of their people in general?
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely, there are many things besides just slavery and the slave trade that are topics that people would like to avoid. And this is one thing that at this meeting that I was at in Philadelphia last week, people are still talking about how do we use oral history and can we use oral history. I'm going to go back to this map. So here along the coast, particularly in the Gambia, along the at the very edge where a lot of the slaves from Africa were taken out into the Atlantic, there has been a lot of tourists that have gone there, and they want to go hear these oral histories. And some historians have looked at this and looked into it and seen how these oral histories and traditions have been distorted by what has been written and by what people want to hear as tourists. So there's that aspect of it, that people are playing towards the tourists and distorting history. But there are also other aspects of conflicts in the past that people don't want to talk about or want to avoid. I had a friend of mine doing his research in the Gambia. He's from the Gambia. He's there. He went as the internal review board of the university required him to take a consent form. So he went with this paper, and he wanted to find out about land conflicts, which are tied up with social issues. And he said, okay, can I interview you about land? And I have this paper. And people said, I'm not talking to you. You're from the government. You have some official paper. I don't know what kind of information do you want. So that's just another example of the way that oral history can be problematic. And one man even told my friend, some history should not be told. Now, there are ways to get around that. Slavery in Africa existed up into the 20th century, and there are communities who it is well known from around that they had been slaves in the past, and because of your last name or because of where you come from, you can know these things. So there are a lot of ways to get around that, but definitely topics that people like to avoid or like to exploit for their own purposes.
I was just curious about your time in South Africa, what you were doing or studying while you were there, and maybe where and when you lived there.
Okay. The first time I went to South Africa was actually through a BYU study abroad program, which unfortunately they don't offer that particular program anymore. I went in 2000 and went to this area here in the Eastern Cape in South Africa. And I lived there for a semester with a Xhosa family, and ended up going back a number of times. For me as a historian, the oral history is the most engaging and rich source for history, partly because of these issues and also because I get to sit down and listen to people. So I ended up coming in contact with the family. It's kind of a long story. Family of Steve Biko, who was an anti-apartheid leader in the late 60s and 1970s. And one of my first projects, I've been going to South Africa ever since then pretty frequently. I lived there in 2008 when I did my dissertation research. I lived there the entire year and have had other stints of extended periods. But I was looking at Steve Biko and his place in African history, South African history in particular, and how people remembered him, how he fit in with African history. And in doing so, I realized that there was this whole other aspect of the history of that particular movement that was not written about. And there was a lot of this political history, intellectual history of the movement, but not much about the community development aspect of the movement. So when I went back in 2008 and lived there, I ended up doing the history of these 3 particular projects, and that included interviewing the people in these villages where they had the projects and trying to understand what the impact of the projects in the villages were. And I, throughout my graduate studies and living there, learned to speak Xhosa, and so was able to do a number of these interviews in Xhosa and English. I don't know if you want to, does that answer it? The last 12 years of my life in 2 minutes.
I have a couple of questions. You talked about us Americans maybe understanding African history. What about the Africans? How much of their history do they know, understand? How much of it are they taught? What versions are they taught? And what do they do with that information? That's one question.
Okay. Okay. That's a great question. As I said, there are these oral traditions, and griots now are still alive and well. Their position in society has changed. Often they're more about music and its performance, but they do have these traditions, and elders do have this oral history that's been passed down. A lot of it has not been recorded. So there's that aspect of it. Now, the colonial education that many received was the history of Europe. And you can imagine if you're going to school in the 1930s in Kenya, there's not African history in the Western world. Why would you be taught it in your school? You're taught about how great the British Empire is and how the British discovered your people, or that sort of thing. So that definitely was part of the education that people received at that time. But then there were these competing traditions, and I'm thinking about in Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom, he talks about going to school and how he was learning about how great they were, so excited to be proud to be part of the British Empire. And then they have this poet, a close-up poet, come to his class. And surprisingly to them, and they think he's pretty brave at doing this, he stands up in front of their principal and talks about the great Xhosa leaders of the past, and he's dressed in his traditional clothing. So there were those competing things, and there were people who picked up on that and had that. I think there's still a challenge, and the history of education in Africa is a very important topic we need to pursue to know how that worked. But also there were some Dar es Salaam in Tanzania in the 70s was there. People spoke of the Dar School of university, very vibrant university where people were putting out these histories and definitely engaging in that. But it's still a little bit of a battle. And even in South Africa itself, they recently changed their curriculum where history is actually not a particular subject. It falls under, it's something like human rights education or something like that. So yeah, there are these competing things, but there are different strands that are running through. I don't know if that answers your question.
And just a second question. How do we overcome, how do we integrate Africa into the global, I mean, what is it? There's tourism, but tourism tends to enforce the stereotypes of wildlife
Yes.
and rural villages. And so now the talk is, and then the other one is aid and NGOs, and sometimes they do maybe good and harm at the same time. So then there's business and education. How do we do that? For instance, I know that this university, if you want to travel and get credit for something you're doing in Africa, there's only a few places you're allowed to go because of this university's, perhaps I would say, oversimplified views of how safe it is to be in certain places or whatever the reasons are. So what forces are going to help with that?
That's a big question. A lot of people are asking. I think that and again, I think this is part of what I was referring to too, is giving Africans and the African voice and recognizing their different perspectives, but also giving that more respect. And I think that, looking at the community development programs that I studied, they were, this is part of the Black consciousness movement. Part of the movement was saying we need to be self-reliant, and they rejected any involvement of white liberals, although that was in some cases more rhetorical than actual practice. But they did need money. And one of the women who talked about, wrote, she was involved, and then she wrote later about this. She said, if you say, okay, people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, that assumes that they have boots and straps to pull up in the first place. So I think there needs to be a combination of that. But the other thing is there are plenty of educated and very intelligent Africans on the continent who need to be drawn into these debates and discussions. And I think it also needs to be a I think business, I think aid, I think all sorts of levels, religious groups have a huge impact there and what they're doing. And so I think there are a lot of different ways that Africa, a multifaceted way that Africa can be brought in to help us understand it more, to be brought out of some of the problems that they are facing, which are in some ways very powerful problems that when they were brought into the world economy. A lot of that stems from that during the colonial period. So there's a lot more to that, how some places have been more successful than others, and all sorts of other ecological aspects to that as well. But I think education to me would probably, if I were to say a single answer, educating us here so that we know how to interact with Africa, and allowing the education and training or supporting that on the African continent so these people can, having a two-way, not just us going there, but bringing them here and also learning from them, but giving them an opportunity to have the education. Big question, though. Any other questions?
Okay, if he got a part two, can I have a part two?
Sure.
And it's in a way a follow-up to my earlier question, and it relates to this question of international engagement. I'm going to pose a theory. If you could go to the April 1994 thing, and you can tell me exactly how crazy this theory is. In terms of the way press coverage, you talked about press coverage earlier about how it shapes our image of Africa. The South African story, I'm going to argue right now, you can tell me how crazy.
Okay.
Is really the struggle against apartheid. That's an international story. U2 and Peter Gabriel were writing songs about that, and that's an international human rights story, not an African story. Rwanda, that's an African story. That, in fact, is the African story. And with press coverage like that, that's how a big part of how we get this view of African history.
No, I think you're hitting on something there, that yes, apartheid, there was a huge international anti-apartheid movement that was big in the United States. This is one thing that Sifiso Ndlovu, when he came, talked about. And the government itself wasn't necessarily anti-apartheid, but many of the people were. And this was spread across Europe. And so I think that, and it was a story of triumph, had to do with race relations, white and black, and not black and black. So it resonated, I think, more with Americans. Interesting, I have a student now who's just doing a research paper on the press coverage of Rwanda. There's been a lot done on that too. But she looked at it, and it was just what was happening between these two groups was hardly explained at all. But it was just, these African tribes are fighting each other and killing each other. And it was just, that was how it was put in the Washington Post and the New York Times. These newspapers are supposed to be really great news sources. So I think that definitely has a lot to do with it. Another aspect of this, to go a little bit deeper beyond conceptions in the way that the press conveyed this or portrayed it. South Africa, in fact, they refused to have any outside mediators when they had their negotiations. They said, we can take care of this ourselves. And the ambassador who spoke earlier this semester talked about that process a little bit. And part of it was because they didn't want to be beholden to any other power. So it's interesting that it was very much part of this international thing, but the people in South Africa said, no, this is our thing. We can handle it. And Nelson Mandela is, one of probably the most widely known African, and definitely part of that. And there are much more that went on within the country and within the continent, as far as that goes, that doesn't get in the press and our idea of what happened. Also, in April '94, just as the genocide was occurring in Rwanda, we had the Black Hawk helicopter that had been shot down in Somalia, which had a big impact on the way that the international community responded to this. And Susan Rice, who is, they say, probably going to be nominated to be the Secretary of State for Africa in the new Obama administration, actually was involved at that point in the Clinton administration, and they didn't want to say this is a genocide because then that would mean that they would have to go in there, and they were afraid of what would happen. So also I think seeing this as this is an African problem has to do with too the way that the international community did or did not want to respond to it. So it's in a way a tragedy there as the different international engagements in these conflicts. Thanks for that.
I'd like to return to historiography. It seems from your explanation of how the field has developed that perhaps given the recent nature or the recent emergence of nation states, if you can call them that in Africa, that non-African historians of Africa and perhaps African historians of Africa may be better equipped to avoid some of the pitfalls of telling this place's history or certain places within this place's history, avoiding the pitfalls of telling it in a way that is the story of nation states,
Okay.
which is a problem in a lot of other areas of the world. I mean, and if you think about other areas of history, you have, a historian of Japan like myself, or a historian of Britain, so I think you're familiar with that. But on the flip side, I wonder if there's a problem with trying to avoid telling their history in kind of continental terms. Do you understand?
Yeah, so there's a tension, you're thinking there might be a tension between national histories and Pan-African
histories. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's...
Yeah, they're both
Yeah.
strands. And it's interesting, the first, so in the 1960s, these historians who were, upon independence, they wanted to highlight the grand and glorious African past. And so a lot of them looked at these great kingdoms, and this is where we get the histories of these highly centralized societies. See, we were just as good as these you Europeans. And that played into then also this national past. I mean, Ghana was celebrated as the first sub-Saharan independent African country. And Ghana, the kingdom of Ghana, was not in that region, but Ghana was this great kingdom in the past. It was actually the same area as the Mali kingdom. And so then Ghana gained the name, they chose this name, and so naming even of the nation is important. But what then you use as to show, okay, this is our great nation, and then how do you tie people together at the same time? When you have countries like Nigeria, very different people, decentralized societies, people who didn't get along with each other even though they came from the same sort of language group and had very similar cultures. And then other centralized societies, different religions. How do you then write a history that brings all those people together? And people did attempt that. And other leaders in different countries would even commission some of these, so it becomes a political thing. You commission these histories, and then if you do something against that, you get fired from the university. I mean, these are also other problems. But there is also a strain of looking at transnational aspects of history, looking at groups before colonialism. How did they interact with the region? So there are regional types of histories. But yeah, they're all there and sort of competing, and then you get these modern histories of trying to make a rainbow nation in South Africa and looking back into the past for that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that definitely is our trends and challenges in African history as well. So I think I need to go. Yes, thank you.